So tonight, in our final session, because of the break in time, we're folding the last two prophetic voices into one session as we hear from both Micah and Isaiah, both of whom provide images that inspire some of our favorite carols. Which begs the question, now that we're actually into the season, what's your favorite Christmas carol and why? What's your favorite Christmas carol and why? I'll tell you at the end which was historically my least favorite Christmas carol and why. Rita, do you want to start? What's your favorite Christmas carol and why?
O Little Town of Bethlehem. O Little Town of Bethlehem. And it's kind of the story that goes behind it, that the guy was in a push at the end to get a song.
Yep.
Really quickly, and he couldn't come up with anything. And he went to bed still kind of in turmoil because he hadn't come up with anything, and that night he dreamt the tune. He was a choir master, and he dreamt the tune, and then he taught it to the kids, and it became a well-known hymn. So it's kind of like the story. And
it's a lovely story. So it's not unlike the story of Silent Night and the organ breaking down. So the organist comes up with the tune on the guitar because the organ won't work.
I always kind of liked A Little Town of Bethlehem. Ever since Sunday school, when we used to sing it. I don't know why. I liked it like the tune of it.
For a lot of people, A Little Town of Bethlehem is a favorite. Even if on this side of the pond you sing it to the wrong tune, but that's okay. That's my grinding tooth moment every Christmas Eve when we sing O Little Town of Bethlehem, and the organist always changes the tune to the one everybody knows here, not the one that's supposed to go there.
Well, it doesn't sound both sides.
I sing it anyway. What's your favorite?
Oh Holy Night.
Oh Holy Night.
I just like it.
It's my wife's least favorite Christmas carol because she and her friend from Sunday school all the way up through, they were forced to sing it as a duet every Christmas Eve. And they came to hate O Holy Night because they had to sing it. It is not an easy carol to sing.
Especially the high notes.
Yes, and it goes all kind of over the place. But it is a beautiful, beautiful hymn.
If it's sung right.
If it's sung right. Mary.
I like them all, but I do Silent Night. I just remember I gave birth the 15th of December, and the Confederation Choir came through the hospital singing that song, and I had a dear little boy in my arms. And my name was Mary.
Yeah. And it was silent by then. Well, that's a very wonderful reason for liking Silent Night.
Hark the Herald Angels Sing.
Hark the Herald Angels Sing, and why?
It's upbeat.
It's one you can really get into, and people tend to bellow it out. It's got that kind of rousing feel to it. It's another one you get in trouble if you miss it out on Christmas. There are certain ones that people expect to hear, and Hark the Herald is one of them. Angus.
I've been with Silent Night as well.
Yeah. I'm making notes. Which ones do I have to have?
I like the atmosphere that it creates, and it's usually the key hymn that's sung during the candlelight service, Christmas Eve.
Yes, it's one of two that gets used all the time when we dim the lights for the candlelight service because everybody knows the words. Away in a Manger and Silent Night, but they both have that kind of lullaby feel to them, and they really suit that moment when we're lighting the candles and the big lights are going out. Keep on going. Your favorite carol and why? Them all. Okay, if you had to choose only one you could listen to.
Any of the ones that are mentioned.
Okay, we'll move right along.
Beautiful Star of Bethlehem.
Beautiful Star of Bethlehem. Why that
I
one?
like the words.
It's more of a Christmas song than a Christmas carol, but it's a beautiful song. Yeah.
And we don't sing it enough.
No, it's not in any of the hymn books because it's not a carol. Yeah. I think, though, it's one of the songs at the concert this Sunday. Beautiful Star of Bethlehem.
Unfortunately, I can't be here.
Well, we'll be singing that song.
Beautiful.
I'm pretty sure it's one of the ones on the list. I just got the list from Joy.
I like the way you manger.
Way in a Manger.
Yeah, it tells the story and it's something I did when I was at Sunday school.
Yep. For a lot of kids, it's the first hymn they learn. That and Jesus Love Us.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
And but also, you're right, it tells the story, and that's one of the things that stands out about the Christmas carols. A lot of them are story hymns. They're not thematic, the love of God, the glory of God. They tell the story or part of the story. Like Hark the Herald tells you what the angels did, or about the shepherds, or about the wise men, or about Mary and Joseph, like O Little Town of Bethlehem.
Another one I I'm starting to like is Mary, Did You Know?
Mary, Did You Know? Yeah. And that's another one of those very beautiful
Because
Christmas songs you don't get to sing as a
YouTube,
carol.
there's a whole lot of different artists doing it
Mm-hmm.
so beautifully,
Mm-hmm.
like a cappella, and just
Yeah.
I'm just starting to love that song.
Yeah, it is a beautiful song, Mary, Did You Know? And a wonderful, evocative idea of asking, say, Mary, did you know?
Mhm.
Did you realize at the time what was really going on? It's a very, very powerful song. There are lots of traditions around Christmas carols and around Christmas services. It was an Anglican bishop, I think the Bishop of Truro, who literally invented what we now think of as the traditional Christmas Eve service of lessons and carols. He was trying to come up with something for a special event, and he came up with the service of 9 lessons and carols, which has become the template for Christmas Eve services everywhere ever since. And it, if you're in the Anglican Church especially, it has a very specific set of readings and carols that basically tell the whole story. And part of it is based on very good advice that because of the nature of the story, of the scripture, and because of the nature of the carols, the way they reflect on the scripture, that often, in many ways, lots of people would argue, lots of experts in worship and preaching would argue, the best thing you can do on Christmas is shut up and listen to the story and sing the hymns. Because they speak for themselves. And that if there's a sermon or a homily, it should be a very, a short, meditative linking of things together, because it's one of those occasions, a bit like Good Friday and Maundy Thursday. The scripture, just telling the story and singing the hymns that go with the story, speaks more powerfully than anything that the preacher could come up with on their own. I very much grew up with that tradition, although as a Presbyterian, but very much in my part of the world, that sort of standard 9 lessons and carols is everywhere. And one of the places that did it best, I never missed, and I found it hasn't been done for the last couple of years because of COVID. It's being done this year, but not till next week. So I found the 2019 version. And I chose it because they almost always start with the same hymn. Once in Royal David City is the opening hymn for 9 lessons and carols, usually. And it always begins with a solo verse before the rest of the choir and then the congregation join in. And if you're doing it as an Anglican, it's usually some, little boy treble in his white gown doing the hymn. So every Christmas service I ever went to began with a little town of Bethlehem, with Once in a While David City, and I hated it because my little brother's name was David. And why the heck did he get a carol and I didn't get one? I can remember as I wasn't going to mention that I mentioned it Easter for all the wrong reasons. I was very little, but all that struck me was, Royal David, there's nothing royal about your David. It's a pain in the neck. Anyway.
That to his mother.
Yeah. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, I lost the cable for the this, so I'm going to have to just play the hymn to you on here and hope that it's at its loudest.
Kind of leaving it for Jean, but I guess Jean's not.
Okay, something. Just a second, because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Check the volume here. That's why the volume's way down. Try this again.
Cable would be upstairs.
No, I went up to look. We don't have one here. No, the dog knocked the box over, and I didn't realize the cable. That was filmed in 2019 at Holy Trinity, which is a Presbyterian church across the street from my college in St. Andrews. And that's the annual college or university carol service. The university chapel isn't big enough to accommodate it, so they borrow Holy Trinity, and that was the university chapel choir. The red gowns aren't choir gowns, they're academic gowns. The arts and science undergraduates wear scarlet gowns. The black gowns that were amongst them were divinity students, except for the director. And and brass bands are a feature of British Christmas Eve services. We always had brass at ours because my hometown was a small town, but it had a championship brass band. So organ, brass band, and all they pull out all the stops. So
Yeah, pipe organ was good.
the pipe organ was excellent. The pipe organ that's in the university chapel is even more magnificent, but the chapel's not big enough for all the people. But everyone that you saw, all the musicians, the brass musicians, and actually you didn't see them there, but there are two organists, one playing, one turning the pages, and then they switch back and forth, are all students of the university. And the people up front, on the one side in a white gown, that was the assistant chaplain who's Anglican, and up in the pulpit was the actual chaplain to the university, who's always Presbyterian. And was an undergraduate with me when I was there. Or rather, no, sorry, his brother was. This is the younger brother now. So, Micah and Isaiah. We don't really know much about Micah, beyond that he was a contemporary of Isaiah, and of Amos, and of Hosea. And like Amos, he was from a village in Judah. He didn't come from Jerusalem itself. He wasn't a member of any elite. He wasn't from a priestly family. He wasn't from a prophetic family, because like priesthood and being a Levite, prophetic ministry tended at that era to run in families. And he wasn't a professional prophet, wasn't a scribe, or any of those things. We don't know much about him, except that he's from small town Judah, from the agricultural background that was a background of most of the people. And his background is reflected in his ministry. It's reflected in his concern for the ills that are afflicting life in small towns and villages all through his era. And he speaks out against the political and religious corruption in high places. So he's not fond of the powers that be in Jerusalem. And he's very concerned about the impact that their corruption is having on the religious life of Israel and on the everyday life of Israel. Historically, Micah was active roughly between 750 and 680 BC, before the ministry of Jesus, when the Jewish nation is divided into two, between a northern kingdom called Israel, with its capital at Samaria, and a southern kingdom which comprises of Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem. So it's still, it's the era before, not long before, but before the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and all the rest have paraded through. The kingdom that David had created has splintered into two, but it's still there, albeit in two parts. But in chapter 1, Micah already is foretelling the fall of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and the ultimate desolation of Jerusalem. He sees that as happening further down the road. The northern kingdom and its capital of Samaria did indeed fall to the Assyrians during Micah's ministry. So he sees that happen. By comparison, Isaiah prophesies the fall of Jerusalem more than 100 years after his own death. It doesn't happen until 586. He prophesies the Babylonian captivity that follows it. And he prophesies the redemption of God's people out of that captivity in Babylon and the restoration of Jerusalem. It's an incredibly long scope of time in in the prophecy of Isaiah. In fact, it's the length and the scope of the book and of the prophecy, and the fact that it clearly breaks down into two very distinct parts. The first one is often called the Book of Judgment, and as its title suggests, it's mostly concerned with the coming judgment. Awful things are going to happen, and that takes up chapters 1 through 39. And then the second part is sometimes called the Book of Comfort, and that's the one that has more stress on the hope of restoration, of the return from exile and the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and that takes up chapters 40 through 66. And it breaks down into other smaller divisions, but those are the two big divisions that scholars note. And it's led many scholars to suggest that, that there are, in a sense, at least two Isaiahs, and possibly as many as three, who are doing the writing. And that they see that first book of judgment, that first half of the book, the pre-exile book, to be Isaiah himself. And then the rest of the work of the book, covering the era of the actual captivity in Babylon, and then the return from Babylon, suggesting that Isaiah goes into the exile, but prophets had, like Jesus, had circles of disciples. And so the suggestion is that for the prophetic ministry to have been that long, it suggests, because we don't know exactly when Isaiah dies, that his disciples continue the work. That it's kind of the Isaiah begins it, and his disciples continue it, and they're there through the exile and into the return. Whether that's true or not, it's one of the intriguing debates that gets drawn up just by the sheer length of and scope of the prophetic ministry.
Well, people lived a long time in those days, didn't they?
Historically, when you go back in the deep dark time, they're given sort of symbolically long years of life. But that's not true by this era. People are living some are living to a good age, but they're not living those kind of symbolic, almost timeless, ages.
900s.
Yes, they're not at that point, and certainly that's never suggested by for Isaiah. I mean, we know approximately when he died, or we think we do. So whether it's actually Isaiah himself seeing that far into the future, or it's the school of Isaiah, the circle of Isaiah's disciples who go with him into captivity, who are continuing his prophetic ministry, that would not have been unusual. Remember, as I mentioned before, prophetic ministry was often seen as hereditary. Amos makes the point of saying, "I'm neither a prophet nor a prophet's son. I didn't grow up doing this. I wasn't trained to do this. I'm just a farmer, and God gave me this prophetic ministry." So who knows? But it's an intriguing thought. Thematically, for Micah, the prophetic message that he brings moves back and forth between prophecies of doom and destruction and prophecies of hope with judgment leading to deliverance. And he kind of moves back and forth between them. But in Isaiah, as we've already seen, the book itself is divided almost in half, with the first half having its heavy emphasis on judgment, and the second half having its heavier emphasis on hope. And speaking of prophecies of doom and hope, as we go into our second holiday season under the shadow of COVID-19, what are you hoping for most this Christmas? What are you hoping for most this Christmas? And Shelley, I'm going to pick on you first to kick us off.
I never really thought of it. That we learn how to live with COVID, I think, is when we come out of this.
That we learn how to live with it. Yeah, because it's been intriguing how in the last 2-3 weeks, you see the experts subtly moving from the word pandemic to the word endemic. This is something that will be ever with us and we'll have to learn how to live with it. You know, like the flu, it'll never actually go away. So how we learn to live with it. What are you hoping for this Christmas? That your husband will choose his favorite carol finally.
Other than peace and that, like, things are not going to be big for us anyway.
Mhm.
Our family's all away, and so just that things will be quiet and peaceful.
No last minute shock and horror, no
No.
new variants suddenly turning up on Christmas
Well,
Eve.
The variances aren't going to affect us because we're not going to travel, so.
The problem is they do.
Yes, I know.
And yourself.
What's the question?
Sorry?
What's the question?
What are you hoping for most this Christmas?
Good health, I think.
Mm-hmm. At this time of year, I mean, that's one of the big things about looking ahead. You know, you look at the back, you look ahead, and we hope for good health in the coming year. It's a very traditional aspect of the season. Angus?
Nothing much has changed with me for Christmas or COVID, so pretty much the same.
So you're hoping nothing, it continues, that nothing much changes.
That's what I see.
Yes. What are you hoping for?
We're hoping that the head of government or that we'll see and not wait too long to close things down for COVID.
Mm-hmm. The governments would be more quickly responsive. Mary.
I just hope we don't have too many of these things that are supposed to be caused by global warming.
Mm-hmm.
It's sad to hear that people in DC are going through. I don't
The
think
global
it's,
warming stuff is kind of being pushed a bit on the back burner by COVID. And that's kind of scary because it's not like we have time to waste or play with. But and the evidence of it in BC is pretty scary.
no, we're in for.
Mm-hmm.
I guess basically what Mary said there.
Wise answer. What she said, yes.
No, hopefully peace and happiness.
Yep.
The biggest thing.
Nancy?
Well, dealing with this on a daily basis, I just kind of hope that we all find peace in our minds and peace in our heart,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully we keep things as like better or, not worse.
Yeah.
than this.
And we have been so fortunate to be on the island and have had a very successful, so far, God willing, continuing kind of fight against COVID.
But I always have these scares
Yeah.
when I'm dealing with the public. And I'm in full view or full full exposure, I just fear that, one day I could get it,
Mhm.
and it scares me.
Mhm. Yeah. I think it scares a lot of people who work in the front line with public, in the public, that you can't really avoid it.
And you can't really trust anybody because you don't know who may have it, who may not, who may be,
You don't know who's following the guidelines and who isn't. They may be
yeah.
doing what they're supposed to do in front of you.
And you don't know who's vaxxed and who's
No.
not.
Yep. Yep.
So, yeah, those fears.
Yeah. By the way, if you come to the concert, you need to be vaxxed. Rita.
Just hoping that our family will get home,
Yep.
really, and see the boys and their families. But if they didn't get home last year, so we
Yep.
just hope that they get home this year and visit with them.
And we have the same hope in reverse, that everything will stay open long enough for us to go to the kids at Christmas. Although Kathy's already made it very clear that if things get closed down, she's staying there. She's not getting cut off from her grandchildren for another 2 years. So if we're away and that happens, you may need to start looking for other arrangements. Finally, a few final words about Isaiah before we get really into the texts. We need to, it's worth taking note that in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Isaiah introduces a whole major section of the Hebrew Bible. It introduces the group of prophets who are known in the Hebrew Bible as the latter or later prophets. And the NIV Study Bible put it well, this is fitting since he is sometimes referred to as the Prince of the Prophets. So Isaiah himself is very important, and he's significant enough that his book is used as the one that's the keystone for a whole section of the Bible, and it's the Hebrew Bible, and it's that same section is the section from which many of the prophets we've quoted and hear from through Advent are in that same section of the latter prophets. And of course, Isaiah is immensely important for Christians in terms of our understanding of the person and the nature of the Messiah, or the nature of his ministry. One Christian commentator, and I tried to find the quote, it was somebody famous, but I couldn't pin it down. But one Christian commentator even went so far as to say, and I paraphrase, that without Isaiah, we'd have nothing to say or sing at Christmas. And actually, if you think about and go through them, especially in the language that gets repeated in prayers and calls to worship and whatnot, how much of it is Isaiah, bits plucked from Isaiah. And if you look at the carols again, how much of what we hear and sing in the carols is either quoted from or alluding to the messianic prophecies of Isaiah. That if there was no Isaiah, what would we say and sing at Christmas? He's the prophet that's wound all through the Christmas message. So we're looking at two prophets tonight. We've looked at their background. Let's have a quick closer look first at Micah. As I've said, the book of Isaiah has two major divisions. The book of Micah is actually organized, it goes back and forth, but it's organized into three cycles of collections of judgment and deliverance, and they're laid out for you on your notes there. The first one, in chapters 1 and 2, is judgment and restoration of Israel and Judah. The second cycle is more concerned with judgment being brought down on Judah's leaders, but giving future hope to the ordinary people, to God's people. That's chapters 3 through 5. And then the third collection is an indictment of the people and the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. the hope through all of that is for restoration. And that restoration and future hope and ultimate triumph all lie for Micah in the coming of the Messiah. Let's look at the text. Chapter 5 was originally our text and still is, but I've shortened what I'm using from it because we're covering Isaiah as well this evening. But let's begin at Micah chapter 5 and verse 1. It comes from that second prophetic cycle where the emphasis is on indicting Judah's leaders for their failures, but at the same time, giving a word of future hope for ordinary people. The NIV Bible the translation gives this chapter the heading, A Promised Ruler from Bethlehem, and takes us right to the heart of our Christian celebration of Christmas. But it begins with the seriousness of the threat that's facing biblical Jerusalem, Jerusalem of Micah's time. Verse 5. This is the God speaking through the prophet to the people of Jerusalem. Marshal your troops now, city of troops, for a siege is laid against us. Call for the people of Jerusalem to mobilize against the coming Assyrian attack, and sort of suggesting that they've already been building up city of troops, that they've been building up their forces. Well, get them gathered and ready because the siege has begun. They will strike Israel's ruler on the cheek with a rod. So being struck on the cheek is an image of violence, but also it's very specifically in Hebrew culture, in that culture, a symbol of humiliation. To be struck on the cheek or to have your beard pulled is a symbol of dishonor and humiliation. You're unable to protect yourself. But you, verse 2, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah. The name Bethlehem means house of bread. The name Ephrathah means fruitful. They're both images of plenty. Ephrathah is the name of the region in which Bethlehem is located. And Bethlehem itself is about 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem. You can see Jerusalem from Bethlehem. The additional information, why we need to know that it's you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, is because there's more than one place called Bethlehem. It's quite a common village name, and it's like Pubnico in Nova Scotia, East Pubnico, West Pubnico, Lower Pubnico, Upper Pubnico, Little Inner Harbour Pubnico, however many Pubnicos there are, or Rustico on PEI. There are many Bethlehems, and so Bethlehem Ephrathah is so you know which one we're talking about. Though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel. So specifically, this Bethlehem Ephrathah, is the Bethlehem that was the home of Jesse and his sons. And who is Jesse's most famous son? David, the youngest. And it's out of Bethlehem that David is called to become king. And it is also the place out of which will come the promised Messiah, who is, of course, expected to be of David's line. And this prophecy we already heard referred to because the Bible study ended up leaching and overlapping with Advent. It was supposed to finish the week before Advent, but this past week we heard part of the story of the Magi and Herod inquiring of the Magi where and when the child is to be born, and asking then his high priests and experts in the Bible what the facts were, and they all quote Micah. Well, we've always known this, that the Messiah is to become the King of the Jews. The Messiah is to come out of Bethlehem, whose origin is of old, from ancient times. The reference is to the ancient origins of the Davidic kingship, not the age of Bethlehem itself. Although when you read it through, it kind of almost sounds like it's saying that Bethlehem is ancient. Well, it was, but the grammatically, the reference is actually to the ancient line of David.
Well, then in the New Testament, they kind of forgot about Bethlehem, saying that nothing good can come from Nazareth.
But Nazareth and Bethlehem are not the same.
No,
No.
but they referred to Christ as coming from Nazareth. No
Yes,
connection
because
to
by then,
Bethlehem.
after the birth and the flight into Egypt, when the Holy Family returns, they don't return to Judah. They go to Galilee and they set up home in Nazareth. So Jesus is raised, he's born in Bethlehem, but he's raised in Nazareth. And so he's referred to as the Nazarene. He's Jesus from Nazareth. That's where his family is from. It's not where he was born, but where he was raised. And that's a common saying at the time. It's like the kind of slur of Newfie jokes that irritates Newfoundlanders. It was a common slur on nothing good comes out of Nazareth. And they use that as an insult against Jesus because that's where he was raised. That's where he grew up. So both places lay claim to him. But he's born in Bethlehem, and that was the prophecy that the Messiah would come out of Bethlehem, which he does. Therefore, Israel will be abandoned. This is us getting to the prophetic era of Micah, and he's looking at, but before all that happens, Jerusalem and Judah are going to fall. And the land will be abandoned. We're going to be sent into exile. We're going to be given over to our enemies until the time when she who is in labor bears a son. And this is another one of those occasions where what's a personification of Israel in the Old Testament becomes, in the fulfillment of the prophetic message through the birth of Jesus, becomes Mary. She becomes the one who is in labor, who bears a son. The implication in Micah for the coming of Messiah is of a restoration when the time has fully come. When Mother Israel, when her time comes, when the time's fully come, she'll produce the Messiah out of the line of David. And the rest of his brothers will return to join the Israelites. So it's a prophecy of both the judgment and the hope. Israel will be abandoned, but only until that time, when the time is right, and Mother Israel produces a son who is the Messiah. Verse 4, he will stand and shepherd his flock. The shepherd image obviously is being applied to Messiah, but it's also one of the most ancient images of the Jewish kings, and also one of the most ancient images for God himself. And of course, it's a very close image for King David, who actually and literally begins life as a shepherd. And the image that's being used, that's being held up as a model for kingship, is of one who cares for, who protects, who guides, and who provides for his people. Not one who lords it over his people like a tyrant. Not one who uses and abuses them for his own grandeur. But very much that the king should be like God, who is a shepherd of his people, who cares for his people, who protects his people, who guides his people, who provides his people. In the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord is God. That's a rebuke. May not sound like it, but it is. Who is this one? He will stand up and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, unlike the current corrupt leadership, which seeks strength in its own power, doing its own thing, grabbing what it can. Messiah's strength and power will be rooted in God, not in armies and wealth and corruption and power. And they, the people, will then live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. And that's a vision of the prophets, that the future hope for God's people, specifically to live securely, as opposed to the threat of violence and destruction they're living in Micah's time, comes with the fulfillment of the messianic prophecy. When Messiah comes, all the uncertainty, the violence, the corruption that's part of their reality now will be redressed when Messiah comes. And that's where our Christian reading of Micah and of chapter 5 usually end at Advent and Christmas, with that tiny little section of 4 verses out of the whole chapter. That's, with one other exception, one other passage that we sometimes quote, that's it for Micah at Advent. It's not much. Micah himself, however, is a Hebrew prophet, and he continues with a much more warlike version of Messiah than we're accustomed to, or comfortable with, which is why we don't read the rest of chapter 5 at Christmas. Let's just, without commentary, let's just read through the rest of the chapter to see what I mean before I say anything further. So we've heard all this lovely, future hope, the Messiah will come, corruption will end, he will be a good shepherd, and so forth and so on. Verse 5, and he will be our peace when the Assyrians invade our land and march through our fortresses. We will raise against them 7 shepherds, even 8 commanders, who will rule the land of Assyria with the sword, the land of Nimrod with drawn sword. He, Messiah, will deliver us from the Assyrians when they invade our land and march across our borders. The remnant of Jacob will be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which do not wait for anyone or depend on man. The remnant of Jacob will be among the nations, in the midst of many peoples, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among flocks of sheep, which mauls and mangles as it goes, and no one can rescue. This is revenge on a grand scale. Your hand will be lifted up in triumph over your enemies, and all your foes will be destroyed. In that day, declares the Lord, I will destroy your horses from among you and demolish your chariots. This is the prophet speaking to the Assyrians. I will destroy the cities of your land and tear down all your strongholds. I will destroy your witchcraft, and you will no longer cast spells. I will destroy your idols and your sacred stones from among you. You will no longer bow down to the work of your hands. I will uproot from among you your Asherah poles. When I demolish your cities, I will take vengeance in anger and wrath on the nations that have not obeyed me. You imagine the reaction on Christmas Eve in amongst the candlelight if I didn't stop at verse 4, but read aloud all the way to the end of the chapter. So what's going on?
What was that 7? 7, it's not in this version.
How did Jacob get into it?
Hmm?
How did Jacob get into the picture there?
Which are the remnant of Jacob. That's what's left of the people. They're the children of Jacob. It's just a reference to, the Israelites are going to be invaded, their land's going to be destroyed, they're going to be taken off as exiles. Only a remnant are going to be left. And one of the ways of referring to them is a remnant of Jacob. Jacob's the kind of founding father, one of the founding fathers. So that's why he's there. The remnant of Jacob are the few that are left, scattered around as exiles among the nations. But I'm going to draw them all up together.
Is there anything significant about that? He will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 leaders of
There's a whole very complex Hebrew thing that we're not going to get into. Yes, there is, but it doesn't.
No,
But it gets very complex and it gets into.
I remember reading it last week.
Yes, yeah. And I thought somebody would ask, and I was going to say, I'm sorry, but we don't have time to go there. Not this time around.
So this would be roughly 740, 750.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is looking at beyond the punishments that's coming to the restoration. But it's a restoration that comes about through violence and war and bloody revenge. So what's going on with that? Why does Micah's Messiah seem so different from the one that Christians proclaim in Jesus? Well, let's leave that question to the side for the moment, because we're going to come back to it shortly, but move on to our text from Isaiah and chapter 8. We're starting at chapter 8, verse 19, and going into the first few verses of chapter 9. We've already touched on the context of Isaiah as a prophet whose prophetic ministry covers a vast scope of time and action. The growing crisis, it begins before the fall of Jerusalem with the growing crisis and the threat of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, then the harsh reality of the fall of Jerusalem, and it's the Assyrians who overrun the northern kingdom, and then Samaria and the northern kingdom, and then it's the Babylonians that replace the Assyrians, and they complete the job by overrunning Judah and Jerusalem.
Do these nationalities exist today?
Their descendants in various ways do. I mean, the name of the land of Syria comes from the Assyrians. The Babylonians were the race that occupied what today is largely Iraq. And there would be folks who would be peoples who would be descendants of those peoples. But at this point, it's the point at which they as peoples achieve power and build empires. First the Assyrians, and then they're overcome by the Babylonians, replaced by the Babylonians. And Isaiah is there in that growing threat of the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the harsh reality of the fall of Jerusalem, the Babylonian captivity, keeping alive the hope of redemption amongst the captives, and then finally the hope of redemption for God's people and their eventual return to Judah and Jerusalem. Well, our text this evening is from the early chapters of Isaiah, which has a heavy emphasis. In that part of the book, the heavy emphasis is more on the coming judgment. It's waiting for the shoe, the other shoe to drop. But in this particular section, the NIV titles this section, Darkness Turns to Light. This is one of the parts of the early part of the book where, yes, you've got the judgment, but you've also got the glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. We start, however, with the darkness. Verse 19. And this is God speaking through the prophet to the people as they're kind of, and what it's speaking to is the kind of turmoil and disarray there is in the culture and the society as they see their doom coming towards them. As their world, they can see it's collapsing around them. When someone tells you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? Consult God's instruction and the testimony of warning. If anyone does not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn. They're not speaking from light, they're speaking from darkness. Distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upward, they will curse their king and their God. Then they will look toward the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. It's an incredibly powerful picture of a society that is being completely overwhelmed and unnerved by the trouble that it sees all around it. That it feels like the earth's moving beneath their feet, that nothing that they've relied on always before can be relied upon now. And they're turning to all kinds of crazy. Yeah, and you can find that in almost every age. You can look for that. And it certainly has resonance in our own time, where we're constantly being told that society has largely lost trust in traditional sources of authority and leadership. We don't trust politicians. We don't trust the law. We don't trust the church, especially if you're younger. The younger you are, the worse it gets. The traditional, whether it's government, law, education, or the church, all those traditional standards of authority and guidance and leadership are less and less trusted. And if you don't trust them, then where are you turning to for your hope? The internet. And I'm not joking. We start turning, when we start distrusting the sources of authority, we start turning instead to the false hope that's offered by superstition or quackery. Horse pills to cure COVID, anyone? There are still people taking horse pills in the belief that it will cure COVID, and worse beside. Where do you go? What do you start to believe in when you lose faith in the structures that have held everything together? Verse 9. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he, that is God, humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Those are the lands of northern Israel that suffered most under the Assyrian invasions. But in the future, that happened in the past, in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, which Christians read as being a prophecy fulfilled in the ministry of Jesus.
The he's aren't capitalized.
I'm sorry?
The he's are not uppercase.
No, but that's our convention. That's it changes. That's a grammatical convention. The only one that matters is when they're using the word Lord and how they write that. But it's God that they're talking about.
I've noticed other places where they use he referring to God. It is uppercase.
It
Yeah, you're right.
may depend. Yeah, it may partly depend on the translation.
Okay.
And
There's quite a few that don't capitalize.
Yeah. Where was that? Yeah. So Christians read that reference to Galilee because that's where Nazareth is, as being fulfilled in the ministry of Jesus, that he will honor Galilee. Messiah is born in Bethlehem, but he comes out of Galilee, comes out of Nazareth. And whether it's what the prophet's referring to or not, it always intrigues me that one of the reasons that the most religiously conservative part of Palestine in the time of Jesus was Jerusalem and Judah, and especially the area of Judah right around Jerusalem. Very conservative, very rigid. And they were very suspicious of anybody who came from Galilee. They were very dubious about the purity of their religion. And that wasn't just because they were on the other side of Samaria, which was the land of heretics, but it was because Galilee had huge settlements of people of Gentiles from other nations. That Jews in Galilee lived side by side with Gentiles from many different places. Partly because the Romans had set up an area called the Decapolis of 10 cities where it had settled retired legionaries. And by that time, legionaries weren't all, Roman legionaries were mostly from other parts of the empire. There weren't enough Italians to fill the legions. So a Roman legionary, when he was given land and his bonus at the end of his 20 years of service and a place to settle, they were often settled in troubled places or newly conquered lands to be a kind of resident fifth column, that if the native population rose up, you had a kind of reserve militia of retired, trained legionaries who could be called, and they continued to train as a citizen militia even after they left the legions. And it was so they could be called out on service if need be. And there were 10 cities through Galilee. So there were a lot of Gentiles, a lot of other nations living in Galilee at the time of Jesus. Then we get to verse 2, and this is the bit we recognize. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. The light breaking through the darkness is an image of hope and the coming of Messiah. The light, and light, of course, becomes one of the principal themes or images of Advent and Christmas. Think of all those carols. Think of all those candles. Think of all those Christmas lights. Light becomes one of the major images of the season. People walking in darkness have seen a great light. Verse 3, you have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. We more often than not miss out those two verses of the Christmas Eve. We jump from verse 2 to verse 5. But what the prophet is doing in those two verses is reaching back into Israel's earliest history, to the era of the judges, and predicting that God will crush the Assyrians and eventually the Babylonians, just as Gideon, the judge, once defeated the Midianites. And if you want to read that story, it's Judges chapter 7. So he's reaching back into history. It's one of those, what God has done, God can do moments. The God who has been with you in the past will be with you in the future. And, still in verse 5, we're still with that image. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. Like I said, normally when we have this reading from chapter 9, we start at verse 2 and then skip to verse 6, and we leave out the bit about plunder, shattered yokes, and warriors' bloody boots. But again, it's important to note, not to miss it here, because this is one of the images that shape our Christian view of Messiah that we get from Isaiah. It's part of his, one of his favorite, the destruction of arms and armor is one of the prophet's favorite images of peace. It's more than just wars will stop, but the very material of war will be destroyed because there'll be no need for it anymore. All the evidence of war, all the accoutrements of war will become pointless. So profound will God's peace be. We are more familiar with the image from chapter 2. We hear it at Remembrance Day. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. It's one of Isaiah's favorite images of what the world will be like when Messiah establishes his reign. When Messiah is in charge, there will be no more war. So profoundly so that there will be no need for the means of war, and there will be no honor or glory in keeping them around. They'll be destroyed and done away with as a history not to be remembered. Why? Verse 6. For to us a child is born. And now we're really at that place that we recognize most of all from our Christmas Eve services. To us, a son is given. Not just any old son. This is a royal son, a son of the house of David. And the government will be on his shoulders. And then what follows is a list of throne names or royal titles, each signifying a different aspect of Messiah's reign. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Remember, his authority and his power come from God, so these are very divine sounding titles. Wonderful Counselor. The counselors were those who advised the king on important decisions, putting programs into place for the people. As Wonderful Counselor, chief among the counselors, the Messiah himself will put into place a program that fulfills God's will and purpose for the world. Mighty God. This Messiah's authority and power, again, doesn't come from his own strength or might or wealth or anything else, but it comes directly from God himself. He is the presence of God, of the mighty God among us. Everlasting Father. And that promise of hope isn't just for a moment or a day. This is not Camelot. There will be one brief shining moment on a hill, and then it'll become a legend. When this hope is fulfilled, it will be for all eternity, because it's the promise of the everlasting Father. And ultimately, he will be the Prince of Peace. But peace isn't just the lack of violence or war, but the coming of wholeness and well-being. That's the reign that Messiah brings in. And there are many references, as Jesus goes through his ministry, if you listen carefully, there are many references to that understanding of Messiah. That with his coming, what he's coming in, what he's trying to bring to fruition is wholeness and well-being. Verse 7, of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Again, you need to keep in part of your mind that we're reading Jewish prophecy, Hebrew prophecy, which is looking for the coming of a Jewish Messiah. As Christians, we see that prophecy fulfilled in Jesus Christ, but we also see Christ opening the door. I have many sheep, many children, and that what is, I came first to the house of Israel, but then. The Hebrew prophets, it's very much that narrow vision of a Jewish Messiah is coming for the Jewish people. When Messiah comes in Christ, it's with a much wider agenda than that. And we're looking at all of this story from that perspective, because we're the heirs of that wider perspective. So, Prince of Peace or Destroyer of Cities, will the real Messiah please stand up? What kind of Messiah is the right kind of Messiah? Well, the answer depends on what kind of Messiah you're looking for or you're expecting. And by the time of Jesus, there were at least 3 different schools, and I underscore at least 3 different main schools of thought about who and what Messiah would be. There were lots of people who had thoughts about Messiah, but these are the 3 main ideas of how this would come about. Firstly, there were those who lived in expectation that God would send a warrior Messiah, like a new King David, who, as David had done before, would take up the sword, call up the armies of Israel and would free Israel from foreign occupation and then reestablish the kingdom as an independent Israel, even greater than before. And Jerusalem then, rather than being attacked, destroyed, or occupied, will become, in Micah's other most famous prophecy, the place to which the nations turn in honor and peace. Let's just glance quickly at that other famous prophecy from Micah. Micah chapter 4 begins at verse 1. And again, they're words that we sometimes hear at Advent and Christmas, Advent more especially. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. It is already the highest of the mountains of Judah. You can see Judah is a very hilly part of Palestine, but in any of the roads that are leading up through it, you can see Jerusalem. Sometimes occasional glimpses, sometimes full on, but you can see Jerusalem from everywhere because it does sit on the highest hill. But this is taking that even further, with the highest hill of all the hills and the mountains of the world. It'll be so high, peoples of all the nations will stream to it. Verse 2, and many nations will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that he may walk in his paths, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares. Remember, he and Isaiah are contemporaries. They no doubt are familiar with each other's work. And their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. For the Lord Almighty has spoken. All the nations may walk in the name of their gods, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. So the first kind of Messiah, we do get to peace eventually, but it's by way of power and conquest, by way of the warrior like David. The second major theory, there were those who lived in expectation that God would send a Messiah like Isaiah's suffering servant. And those are really the two main competing, there are others, but those are the two main competing images of God, of Messiah. That he'll come as a warrior, or that he'll come as the suffering servant, who would be more in that mold of David as a shepherd rather than David as a warrior, and that he would lead his people in ways of healing and peace rather than in ways of conquest. It's that Messiah, the image of that Messiah, is best described in the Jewish story of the wounded healer, which is quoted by the Christian writer Henry Newman and is the basis for one of his best-selling devotional books of the same name, The Wounded Healer. And the story, the Jewish story, goes like this. A certain rabbi encounters the prophet Elijah, and he asks him, when will the Messiah come? Elijah answers, go ask him for yourself. Rabbi, puzzled, says, where is he? And how will I know him? And Elijah says, he is at the gates of the city, sitting among the poor, covered in wounds. The others unbind all their wounds at the same time and then bind them up again. But he unbinds his wounds one at a time and binds it up again, saying to himself, perhaps I shall be needed. If so, I must always be ready so as not to delay for a moment. Messiah is the wounded healer who puts the needs of his beloved before himself. That's the suffering servant of Isaiah. He shares our wounds, but he puts our needs before his. And then thirdly, of these principal ideas, There were those who lived in expectation that God himself would come as Messiah. That he wouldn't send a Messiah, he would come in person as Messiah. And our Christian proclamation or understanding is essentially that in the incarnation, that through Christ, that God has come himself in Christ, and that he comes as the suffering servant. He's made his choice, and that choice is to come as a servant and not as a warrior. Remember, our Christian Advent has at least two faces. We're near the end of our time now. So as we finish, remember this. One of the faces of Advent looks back to the first coming of Messiah as the Prince of Peace to be born in Bethlehem. That's the part very much resting in the expectation of the Hebrew prophets in their own context, in their own day. But the other face of Advent is looking forward to the coming again of Messiah, no longer as a helpless child, but as King of Kings and Lord of Hosts. So the warrior king does come. But when he comes, it's to lead the armies of heaven in the final battle at the end of days. So in reality, we gather up all of the expectations of Messiah into one, but interpret and understand those expectations as Christians very differently than the Old Testament prophets would have done originally. But through Advent, we're hearing both that authentic Hebrew voice and its messianic expectation, but we're also overlaying it with our own understanding beyond the coming of Christ to his coming again. So to recap, our Christian understanding of the prophetic voices we hear in Advent tells us, among many things, and many that we haven't touched on, but tells us at least this, that Messiah has come, was born in Bethlehem, and that he is coming again. That in his first advent, he will be born in Bethlehem. That when he comes again, it will be with clouds of glory and the might of heaven. That he will be of the line of David. That he will be the Messiah of peace. That his ultimate goal is to fulfill God's redemptive purposes for all creation, which will finally be fulfilled when he comes in power and glory. And that concludes our limited overview of the prophetic voices of Advent, but I hope it will help you to hear more clearly and deeply as you listen to the Old Testament readings during this Advent, almost all of which we will have touched on in this study. And now that the study itself is over, one final question. From among all the prophetic voices of Advent that we've heard, or that come to your mind, what's your favorite passage or image from the prophetic voices of Advent? Favorite image or passage? I'm going to start in the middle this time and pick on Mary.
I knew this was coming tonight because I was thinking.
I've been saving it up for the very last time.
I was thinking today, oh dear. I have to have time. I don't think I can do it right now.
I really enjoy Micah. But that's, I know, that's not, I enjoy them all. But,
I think what's most stunning to me about Micah is it's such an important part of the readings of the season, but in reality, it's a handful of verses. Like out of the whole book, It's not a
Yeah,
long book,
exactly. Well, I
but
guess
there's
I-
only a very few, but there's such important verses.
Yeah, see, most times I give them the whole,
Hmm.
yeah, I've read them all.
And it's the Bethlehem
Who
passage.
who talked about this?
Anybody else want to jump in with a favorite image or?
I'm sure you'll come up with something.
I like the image that we did tonight, starting in Isaiah 6, because it's in a lot of shows I used to watch as a kid, and so it's something I remember.
The
Or,
for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
the one.
that's my favorite passage.
Yeah, that's one that jumps out at us, I
Yeah.
think, because you know
Yeah.
it.
Because we know
Yeah.
the most.
A lovely Dutch lady in Leamington when I was there the first time who was a wonderful needleworker, presented me one Christmas with that as needlework, that passage, wonderful passage.
There was
I
just
put it
so
up
many-
every Christmas.
It was so many things that, Advent will never be the same, I know that.
Because we have a lot.
I just, those minor, we just kind of never thought of it.
Yeah. Remember, they're minor, not because they're not important.
No, I
It's
know.
a reference to the fact that their books are short, not that they're less important than other books. We're going to end with another piece of Christmas music, and it's one of the hymns. Everything I've played, even though some of them in the course of the study have been either presented as great classical pieces, or in more contemporary forms, everything except the excerpt from Handel's Messiah is also a hymn in our hymnal. It's not a lot of there's quite a few of them that we don't know that well. And this one is one of those hymns, and it's one of the oldest Christmas carols, but it's one of those things, if it wasn't for Isaiah, what would we have to say at Christmas? And then after this, we'll have a closing prayer.
Oh, how a rose from tender stem has sprung of Jesse's lineage coming, as men know have sung. It came a flower bright amid the cold of winter, when hath gone was the night. Isaiah 'twas foretold that Mosiah in mind, with Mary we beholded the Virgin Mother, to show God's love aright. She bore to men a Savior, when half gone was the night. This flowers fragrant tender, with sweetness fills the air, dispels with glorious splendor the darkness everywhere. To Mount yet very God, From sin and death, He saves us and lightens every load.
We used to sing it in Glasgow Road all the time. Isn't that Donald Manson's favourite?
What's that?
Isn't it Donald Manson that used to ask for that all the time?
Well, Aunt Florence used to play it for him, and his mother used to play it